Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. I am Sneha and today I'll discuss how to master REST APIs before your next interview comes in. Now, let me ask you a quick question on this. So, can you build a REST API? If your answer is yes, then it's great. But still, can you explain now why it's designed that way? Because that's exactly the kind of question that often makes the difference in a backend interview. Since most people think backend interviews are all about coding, but interviewers ask questions like why put method used instead of patch in your project? Why you should use an API that is stateless? When to return 204 code instead of 200, and suddenly your mind goes blank. Now you are not writing code anymore, but instead you are explaining your decisions. Now let's be honest, guys. This is how most of us usually learn REST APIs. Like we started with watching a tutorial, started building CRUD project, connect it with database like MongoDB or MySQL and test everything in Postman. And once everything works, we think awesome. I know REST API now. But honestly, I think the same. Then when it comes to interview, and that's when we realize like building an API and understanding an API are two completely different things. Like interviewers don't just want to see that what project you work on, but they want to understand why you made certain decisions, why you use this HTTP method instead of this one, why this status code, and why this design. That's what separates your project from real world engineering. Now let me explain their backend engineer of REST API workflow. Now, whether you are using a music streaming app like you can say Spotify, or any shopping online, or booking a cab like Uber, here every action follows a similar journey behind the scene. Like started with first request is sent, then backend processes it, data is fetched, and finally response comes back. So as a backend developer, you think like that. Our job is not just to make that flow work, but it's to make it secure, scalable, and easy to maintain. And that's what exactly why we need to understand REST API, why it really matters. Now we understood the workflow of REST API. Now see how a request travels between the client and the server. So the question arises that how does client tell the server that what it actually wants to do? That's where HTTP methods comes in. Now you can think of them as actions or instructions that accompany every request. Although there are several HTTP methods in day-to-day backend development, you will mainly work with 5 of them only, like get, post, put, patch, and delete. So let's start with get method. As the name suggests, get is used to retrieve data. It simply asks the server, can you send me this information? For example, when you open your profile or view a list of products, your application is usually making a get request. Same like how post method work. put method work, and patch and delete. You can take a screenshot of it and you can visualize by differentiating their each one's features. Now we have learned how a client tells the server that what action to perform using HTTP methods like previously I discussed using get, post, put, patch and delete. Now here's another important question arise, like how does the server tell the client whether that action was successful or not? So that's where HTTP status code comes in. So think of it like this. Every time your application sends a request, the server processes it and sends back two things: response data and a status code. And that status code tells the client exactly what happened. Like if the number start with 2, so I'm just giving you or explaining. Let's start with our easiest category, that is the number started with 2, which means success. And this tells us what the server received the request and everything working as expected. For example, 200 number, it shows OK. It means the request was successful. Now the number 201, which means created, it is used for a new resource or like a user or an order which was created successfully. And 204 number, that shows no content. It means the operation succeeded but there's nothing to return in the response body. Now you will commonly see 204 after delete operations. Now comes to number started with 3, which denotes redirection. So the number started with 3, you can understand it as the server is saying the resource you are looking for has moved somewhere else, means redirected. So these status code are mostly handled automatically by browsers only. So as a backend developers, we don't use them every day. But still, it's important to know what they mean. Now comes to number started with 4, which shows client errors. And it is one of the most important category. So these errors usually mean something is wrong with the request sent by the clients. For example, number started with 400 which shows bad request. It means the request format is invalid. And the number started with 401 which denotes unauthorized, and it means authentication is required. The number 403 which is forbidden, and it means the user is authenticated but doesn't have permission, means it is forbidden. So you can memorize this by their short mnemonics. Now comes to 404 number, which means not found, and it is probably the most famous status code, that is 404. It simply means the requested resource doesn't exist. Now comes to number started with 5. So finally this number shows which is started with 5. It means server errors, unlike started with number 4. These errors are not the client's fault. Instead, when something went wrong on the server, not client, and it may be an exception occurred. If database is unavailable or another server is not responding, then this status code comes in started with 5 number. And this 500 which denotes internal server error, which is very most common example you see. Now here's a common interview mistake usually students do. Like many beginners return 200 OK for every response, even when something fails. But that's not a good practice. So always return the status code that accurately represents what happened. With this, it makes your API easier to understand, easier to debug, and more professional. So, if you only remember one thing from this slide, remember this simple pattern. Like I have mentioned in my thumbnail, 200 or number started with 2 means success. The number started with 3 means redirection. The number started with 4 means client error, and the number started with 5 means server error. Now once you understand these 4 categories, choosing the right status code becomes very much easier. Now so far we have learned HTTP methods and status codes, but have you ever wondered what actually travels between client and server? So that's exactly what request and a response are. Now let me explain you through a example. Like whenever you click a button, submit a form, or search for something, then your application sends an HTTP request to the server. Now think of it as a message saying, like, hey server, I need you to do something for me. The first part counts here is URL. It tells the server which resource we are trying to access. For example, /API /users using any methods you want to pursue like post, get, patch. Next are query parameters. These are optional values that help us filter, search, or sort the data. For example, if you only want the first 10 users, means you want to sorting the data, so you might send page equal 1 and you apply limit equal 10 for 10 users. Now, the third point is path parameters. They are used when you want a specific resource. Like instead of asking for all users, you write /user/10. It means give me the user whose ID is 10. So this path parameters tells the values included in the URL path, that is 10. Now comes to header part, which contain extra information about the request. Things like authentication token, content type, or the format in which the client wants the response, like in JSON or traditional one, that is XML format. And finally, we have the request body. This is where the actual data is sent to the server. You will mostly use it with post method, put, and patch request. And in modern APIs, it's usually sent in JSON format only, not in XML. Now once the server receives the request, it processes everything and sends back an HTTP response. So the first thing you will see is a status line. This contains HTTP version in your HTTP response, and it contains a status code like 200, that is OK, or 204 that display created. Now same like request, headers also present in response. They provide additional information such as content type, caching, or security related details. And finally, the response body. This is the actual data returned by the server, whether it's a user profile or an error message. This is the information your frontend displays to the user. So, if we put everything together, the communication is actually very simple. Like the client sends a request, the REST API then processes it, and the database is queried if needed. And finally, the server sends a response back. So, every REST API, whether it's in Instagram, Amazon, Netflix, or in your own project like CRUD or anyone, it follow the same communication pattern. Now, one interview tips I would like to leave you with, like don't just focus on writing APIs that work, but always validate it with incoming requests and return meaningful responses. Also, always use the correct HTTPS code. Like those small details are what make an API clean, reliable, and production ready. Now, we will understand the best practices to write REST API. Since anyone can build an API that can work, but as a good backend engineer who build APIs that should be clean, consistent, secure, and easy to maintain. So let's start with naming, like a simple rule which you apply to your English sentence, like grammar. Same likewise happen in REST API. So you will see in almost every production application that uses nouns, not verbs. Like your URL should represent a resource, not an action. So instead of writing something like get users, you should use slash create user or simply slash users. This HTTP method already tells the server that what action you want to perform. Now, another common convention is using plural nouns. So, always prefer slash users, which is used as a collection. Instead of use slash user only, use plural nouns because it keeps your API consistent and easier to understand. Now, we have already discussed previously HTTP methods, but it's worth repeating. So use the correct method for every correct operation, like get for retrieving or reading the data, post for creating the data, put or patch for updating, and delete method for removing the data. So following these standards makes your APIs predictable for every developer who uses them. Now, as your application grows, users won't always want all the data. They will search, filter, and sort results. That's why query parameters are commonly used for filtering, searching, and sorting. Now comes to pagination point. Imagine your database has 1 million users and returning all of them in a single response isn't practical, right? So instead of this, we use pagination to return data in a small chunks as it improves the performance and reduces unnecessary network traffic. Now comes to important point, that is versioning your API. So applications evolve over time. We know that their versions changes. New features are added and old APIs change. Also, the mobile apps may still depend on older version. That's why we version our APIs using roots like /API /version 1, and later we can update it like /API /version 2. This allows us to introduce changes without breaking existing clients. So here versioning helps very much in REST API best practices methods. Now comes to error handling and response format. This is another important best practice which keeping your responses consistent. Whether request succeeds or fail, the response should follow a predictable structure. This makes your front-end development or your debugging and maintenance much easier. Now finally comes to security part. Now never ignore security. Always use HTTPS Hypertext Transfer Protocol with security. Here S stands for security. As when you use HTTPS, it validates your inputs, authenticate the users, and authorize requests. Then it never exposes your sensitive information by using HTTPS, because security is not an optional feature, but it's your part of your designing a good API. Now, following these simple practices today will save you countless hours as your application grow. Now with that, I have covered all those core concepts that every backend developer should know before walking into REST API interviews. Now, let's clear up one confusion that almost every beginner has. That is, authentication and authorization are not the same thing. Authentication, it answers the question like who are you? For example, when you log in using your email or password, the server verifies your identity. That's authentication. But authorization comes after that. Like it answers what are you allowed to do? Just because you have logged in doesn't mean you should have access to everything. For example, an admin can delete users, but a normal user can't delete it. Only admin can. And that's a authorization. There are several authentication methods. There are different ways actually to authenticate users. So, the most common one in modern REST APIs is JWT, that is JSON Wave Token. So, after a successful login, the server generates a token and the client sends that token with future requests. You will also hear about bearer token, OAuth, especially for Google or GitHub login authentication, and APIs key, which are commonly used for server to server communication. Now, you don't need to memorize everything today, so just understand where each one is typically used. Now, let's see the overall JSON Web Token authentication flow, how it actually works. So, first a user logs in, the server verifies the credentials, generates a JWT and sends it back. So from that point onward, every request includes that token in the authorization header. The server validates the token and only then processes the request. So that's why JWT is called a stateless authentication. Means the server doesn't need to store user sessions. Now comes to HTTPS, CORS and rate limiting. So you can understand it as security isn't just about login only. We also use HTTPS to encrypt the data while it's traveling across the internet. And CORS, which means cross origin resource sharing, it basically controls which websites are allowed to access your API. And rate limiting, which is used to prevent abuse by restricting how many requests a client can send in a certain period of time. You can remember it through their use cases. Now, another simple but extremely important practice in REST API, that is input validation. So, never trust data coming from the client. Always validate it on the server, like whether it's an email, your phone number, or any other input. Good validation prevents many common security issues. These are common security threats. Like you will also come across terms like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, or accesses. Now for a beginner, I'll suggest always follow basic security best practices like use HTTPS, hash password instead of storing them in plain text, like starting with hash, at the rate and all. Validate every request. Use short-lived tokens when appropriate. Keep secrets out of your source code and regularly update your dependencies like versions and all while versioning your API as I previously discussed. So these small habits go a long way in building your secure application. Now one thing I want you to remember from this slide, it is like security is not something you can add at the end of a project, but it's something which is very necessary when you design into your API from very first beginning, because a secure API protects not only your application but also your users and their data. Now the last slide, which includes testing and documenting your API. So let's start with API testing tools. So during development, we need a way to send requests to our API without building a front end every time. That's where tools like Postman, Swagger UI, Insomnia, and Curl comes in. So among these, for a beginner especially, I would recommend Postman is the most commonly tool which is used for testing the REST APIs, as their workflow is very simple to use. Now comes to sample Postman request. Here's an example of real API request. You can practice it while logging to Postman. And this is exactly how backend engineers or developers test their APIs before integrating them with the front end. Now, with this, I'm ending this video. So if you found this helpful, give it a thumbs